Thank you very much for joining us for another Ohio Learns 360 family webinar. Today we're joined by Dr. Dave Anderson, clinical psychologist with the Child Mind Institute, and he's going to help us get into the topic of screen time for kids. So thank you very much, Dr. Dave, for joining us, and let's get into it.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
So the first question that's on a lot of people's minds is, what do we mean when we say screen time? Because obviously there's TVs, phones, video games, there's a lot of different types of screen time. So can you talk a little bit about the different types, and are they all the same?
It's a really good question because we want parents to be thinking about the fact that not all screen time is created equal. Because early on in research on screens, and this is kind of even in the pre-smartphone era, people only looked at screens and time. And granted, there are research results related to how much time kids spend on screens, but there are really different effects depending on what kind of screen usage you're talking about. So like, for example, what we know today, if you as a family are watching movies together or you're watching television shows together, that can be a really bonding experience. That is not the kind of screen time most people want to draw attention to as like a red flag. While at the same time, for example, if we go to like the other end of the spectrum, a teenager who has perhaps a proneness to maybe a mental health learning disorder, utilizing social media alone in their room for many hours would be like the other end of the risk spectrum, where that kind of screen use is like what we want to draw attention to. And of course, there's a lot in the middle related to video games and the use of screens in all kinds of different settings. I think the other thing I'll just say about that is that screens are ubiquitous in our lives. So this notion that we wouldn't spend time on screens, most adults spend time on a screen for most of their work life. And in that sense, like we'll kind of see adults who are looking at a computer screen for a lot of their work and then come home and are telling their kids, your eyes are going to get strained from looking at a screen too much. It's like screens are all over the place. This is just, we've got computers in cars, we've got computers at work, we have computers at home. And it's kind of this thought of like, how do we integrate screens in our lives in a way that's healthy and think about how we use and what we expose ourselves to?
And so, when I was growing up, the only screens that really mattered were TVs. And it seems like a lot of research shows that that still is the primary thing that kids are looking at, is TV screens. And that is usually the most, in some ways pernicious effect because they're sedentary. They're sitting there watching a TV screen. Can you talk a little bit about how difficult it is for parents to deal with these other things when they're no longer just worrying about keeping them away from just a TV?
I mean, I think it's true of parents of every generation that, so much of parenting is trying to figure out what you have a roadmap for and what you don't have a roadmap for. And parents having most anxiety about the newest kind of things that are coming about and what they're supposed to do in order to keep their kids healthy and in order to kind of maintain their kids' wellness. I think, you brought up television screens. In our practice, we mostly hear about television as being a main concern for kind of younger kids, in the sense that parents feel guilty if they utilize television or like, they're having their toddler or kid in early elementary school, like watching television, but they know that like this is something where like if they put on an episode of a particular show like Bluey or Daniel Tiger, like their kid will stay focused. And that show is meant to be at some level wholesome and educational. And they can't figure out, though, how much of a balance they're supposed to feel around how much they should use this and how guilty they should feel and that kind of thing. And a lot of times what we'll talk to parents about is like the research on, young kids will kind of go back, especially with TV, to kind of the American Academy of Pediatrics and their recommendations there in thinking about really limiting any sort of screen exposure for kids younger than 2. The main reason for that in kids younger than 2 is that there are just so many developmental tasks you need to engage in as a kid younger than 2 that really involves like just kind of looking around the world, trying to explore the world with your initial motor skills, listening to speech that's spoken to you, not through a television, but in real life. And in that sense, like I'll even say to parents of kids younger than 2, it is better for them to ride in a grocery cart around the grocery store than it is for them to be, on a television at home while you might be doing something else. Because even riding around the grocery cart, it's not like you're playing with them. It's not like you're doing anything active, but they're being exposed to so many things in the world. They're developing their eyesight. They're listening to conversations. They're learning speech, those kinds of things. So, in that sense, like we don't want parents to feel like they're doing something terrible if from time to time, in even a young kid, they might be showing them something or they're seeing it because their siblings are watching. Then as you get to kind of younger child ages, it's thinking about balance. So what we'll often talk to parents about is like, we don't want you to feel guilty about having your kids watch shows. It's more thinking about what you might be displacing about their core kind of wellness and developmental tasks as they're watching TV. So if you could check off the fact that they're going to school, that they have real life friendships and play dates where they're playing with other kids, in real life, that you've got family interactional times, and then it's not affecting their sleep, then you've kind of done away with a lot of the most pernicious effects of TV in young kids, in the sense that like you're not parking them in front of it and making it so they're not having real life friendships developing or real life family interactions or sleep issues. But those are the things to really think about for young kids.
Obviously, we're talking a lot about young kids, but what about older kids? Because as kids get older, social media and things like that are going to be harder and harder to keep out of their hands. So what is the wisdom about screen time and in terms of teenagers?
I mean, there's so much to kind of unpack in this. And the first is to kind of think of it developmentally. It's that frequently people will think of it as like, okay, I have a young child around whom I have a lot of environmental control, and then I have a teenager who I've like given a phone, and perhaps they have access to a computer for school or something like that. And there's this sense that like teenagers are going to independently use screens, and there's like not as much control that adults have over what content teenagers get exposed to and how they use their screens. I think the really important thing to think about is kind of screens on developmental level. Like you look at parental tasks, and from an early age, parents are thinking about table manners. They're thinking about family celebrations. They're thinking about interpersonal skills they want their kids to exhibit on play dates. They're thinking about how they want their kids to behave toward their coaches on, the soccer field or the softball field, or, at swim practice, that kind of thing. And as kids grow up, parents have all these kind of very, developed ideas about what skills they want to teach their kids. And at some level, parents don't have a lot that they can go on as to how they teach their kids skills about being online. And the way that this happens is the way that we teach any behavior. It's a parent models their own behavior. A parent stays regulated when their kid is learning new behaviors and making mistakes. A parent sets up their own rules and values, what they expect to be their behavior online. And then there's sort of this scaffolding of an I do, we do, you do model, where you want to be thinking about screens in the same way. Your kids watch what you do on screens, then they might be doing something with your watchful eye. And then eventually you might be releasing them in the wilderness with the hope, in the same way that parents release teenagers to social events and hope that their teens make safe decisions around sex or drugs or drinking. You want to be having those conversations early and often so that when you release your kids online, you hope the same values you've been talking about for years are the ways that they might behave online. So teenage, behavior online, you lay the groundwork in how you watch your parents. We know that a caregiver is going to be online. We know that a caregiver is often going to have a phone next to them. And so we talk to caregivers like there should be moments in your caregiving life where perhaps your kids do not see you on screens, like as in you eat dinner, but your phone is in another room. Or when you're playing with them, your phone is in another room because that allows you to be present. But they're going to see you on your phone. And the best thing that we can do is from time to time, show kids what we're doing online. Oh, here's what email is. Oh, yeah, I was looking at something and I was looking something up online, or I was utilizing YouTube to learn something about how to actually cut this onion the right way. Or, I was watching this particular video, or I was looking at some pictures that your aunt posted of your cousins and, think about that online. Again, all of this is us modeling behavior, whereas kids get curious. We can talk about what we make comments about, how we behave online, how we make decisions, what content we make decisions about that we're exposed to, that we expose them to. And that really does start early. But let's unpack another part of teens and screens. Take me another direction.
So one of the main things that the Mayo Clinic, for instance, observes about the symptoms of too much screen time are some that I think are obvious to a lot of people, such as obesity, falling grades, things like that. Things that I think you would assume go along with spending too much time in front of a screen. But some of them are a little bit less instinctually obvious, like behavioral problems and increase in violence. So can you talk about that? Because some have to do with physical issues, right? You're sitting there, you're not doing something that's more useful. But behavioral problems and violence seem to actually have to do with the content itself.
Right. So what's really important to unpack about screens is kind of what's real in the research and then what is somewhat sensationalist or overblown. So, and this is really hard for parents to unpack because, look, a conversation like this has a chance to actually unpack some of this nuance. But what most people are seeing is a 1 to 2 minute spot on the news. And that doesn't have a lot of time to unpack nuance. And so what you tend to get is this kind of narrative that is fear mongering, that is like kind of increasing parents' concern and making them think, okay, if I do this, then this is the cause for my kids. What's really important to understand about screens is that, when we're talking about youth mental health, we do not have evidence that screens themselves are causal in terms of causing mental health disorders. What we do have evidence of is that, in particular, for vulnerable youth populations, there can be an exacerbating effect that occurs with screens along certain populations. And this was enough for the Surgeon General to issue an advisory in the past year about screens and saying, look, we know there's enough here that we should be cautioning caregivers about certain negative effects that we see around screens, while at the same time, we should be cautious because more research is needed. We need to understand this better. We have enough to be concerned, but at the same time, we need to kind of map what's known and what's not known. So in that sense, we want parents to be thinking, okay, if my kid is prone to depression or anxiety or body image issues, there is, solid research showing that a lot more time spent on social media and with exposure to content that, perhaps can exacerbate those symptoms can really accelerate a kid who's suffering, in the sense that a kid who's anxious, who goes online and because of algorithms online finds more and more content to feed their anxiety, that could feed some anxiety. A kid who's depressed and isolated, who's then spending too much time online, and that's only increasing their isolation, their FOMO, their sense that their friends are having, amazing lives and they're missing out on all of this stuff. It can increase that depression. Kids who are having body image issues and who are looking at filters online and, kind of images that people have carefully curated that are not really real, but at the same time giving this sense that other bodies look better than theirs, that can really exacerbate symptoms. At the same time, it's really important, and this goes back to the Surgeon General's advisory, there is research showing positive effects of social media exposure for teens, particularly around teens who are ostracized or part of marginalized communities and need to find belonging online where they don't otherwise find it. This is particularly strong, for example, in LGBTQ youth populations, where we can show that communities of belonging online, validating communities that validate that youth's identity and say, look, you're okay. It gets better. You've got friends here. We can talk you through the struggles that you're having, actually decrease depressive symptoms and decrease suicidality and increase the chance that somebody might be well and actually find that kind of belonging they need online. So again, it's kind of important for us to parse these things and make sure that parents understand that screens, and this is another piece that I think we can unpack, screens are not necessarily driving the youth mental health crisis. Screens are likely exacerbating mental health difficulties for particular populations of vulnerable youth. But if we're really going to think about the youth mental health crisis, we need to think a lot bigger than screens, with screens only being kind of likely a more minor factor.
I think that one of the things for parents trying to keep their kids off screens that didn't help them, obviously, was the pandemic. And having kids cooped up for a longer period of time, obviously, led to a lot more screen time. And it led to a lot of bad habits. So can you talk a little bit about the role habits and habit breaking plays in the screen time battle?
Yeah. So a lot of the conversations that we have with parents around screens will start with taking an inventory, where we try to say to parents, okay, let's talk about when your family uses screens. And then eventually we're going to get to kind of what they use them for and what the content is that kids are looking at. But let's just look at when. And for a lot of parents, what they'll say is that screens are a pacifier in terms of certain hot zones. And they'll say, like, look, when I'm trying to get everybody ready for school in the morning, bottom line is a TV on at breakfast or the kids being able to be on their phones or something like that keeps everybody from being at each other's throats because we're not morning people in our family. Or people say, look, when they get home, like allowing them to be on screens in the evening keeps everybody kind of watching content that they actually like or doing things that they actually like or interacting with their friends or something like that or playing video games they like. But, I worry about, and when we get into parental worries, a lot of them are centered around, I worry about whether or not they're not spending enough time on their homework because they're just trying to get to it. Or I worry that it's affecting their sleep. Or I worry that it's affecting maybe their investment in extracurricular activities, or maybe in trying to connect with their friends in real life rather than on video games, or while they play in kind of these interconnected worlds. And we'll say, well, look, there's a real balance in sort of claiming that back. So if you're looking at using screens in the morning, the most common question that we say to parents is, what do you need to have happen in the morning before the screens happen? Because in all honesty, if the kids are going to be on screens and that keeps people pacified, we don't want to make you feel guilty about that. But we want your kids dressed. We want everybody to have eaten some breakfast. Like that's probably the thing that you want to happen by a certain time. And then with whatever bonus time they've got left, boom, maybe they're on the screen, with the understanding that unless they come off the screen to go to school, in a regulated way, they won't get access to it the next morning. We'll set up that kind of plan for a family. Or we'll say, look, how much time does your kid's teacher say they should be spending on homework? In that case, make sure there's a large enough time block in the afternoon for them to spend that time on homework where no screens are available. You're not hurting them. You're not making it so they're left out. Every kid's going to make the argument, oh my God, all my friends are on screens the whole time. I don't have to not be on screens. And your answer is, if I have to be the cruel parent for this moment, I'm going to deal with it. Because, and I say this to parents, like, it's good at times that your child will accuse you of having the most boundaries. That's okay as a parent. That's actually a good, healthy sign. So, we have that moment in the afternoon where kids are really invested in homework. Or we'll say, like, look, one afternoon or two afternoons a week, your job is go to soccer practice and hang with your friends afterwards. Ask a friend to go out for yogurt. Ask a friend to have some ice cream. Ask a friend to take a walk. But you're not going to come home from soccer practice and just be on the screen. That's going to be maybe an IRL day. And then the other things we'll kind of think about are how much sleep a kid needs and when we can put limits on screens and ensure that a kid is off of them. Maybe some kids might use music to go to sleep, or they might listen to a story to go to sleep. That tends to happen more and more in our society. But what we want to remind parents is that people are incredibly dishonest with themselves about how much screens play a role in hurting their sleep. Like I'll say to parents, look, every single app on my phone has a limit where it goes off at midnight, and I am not supposed to use it. Now, granted, the phone will ask me, do I want to be reminded in 15 minutes of said limit? It's not really as hard and fast as I want it to be because the phone doesn't have an interest in having me be off of it. It just wants to look like it does. But I'll say, it's really important for us to think about what behavior we're modeling. And in that sense, not to be actively engaging our screens. We're realistic about the fact that many adults still fall asleep to a show, but it should be a show that's not suspenseful and one that perhaps gives you a neutral to positive emotional state that you can kind of fall asleep to, as opposed to watching Scandal and being riveted and having that delay your sleep. And similarly, anything you're scrolling, clicking, or playing does not help you sleep. It's very likely to kind of keep you awake. We want to think about setting the same boundaries for kids and saying, I do this for myself. I want to do this for you. The last thing I'll talk about is a hot zone for screen time for families is we'll often tell families, make screen time on the weekends be during the hours you need most for your wellness as a caretaker. So I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old. Their screen time tends to be somewhere around the hour before dinner and a little bit after dinner on weekends. Because those are the moments where we've had a big family day, and I'm getting tired. It's getting toward the common witching hour for, kids in this age range where they're just tired and they start going at each other, even if as siblings they were getting along well the whole day. And that's kind of when my wife and I might get the things done that we need to get done or get some dinner cooking and know that our kids can be distracted during that time. And as long as we stick to some of those boundaries around when screens are used on weekends, kids get used to that and they expect it. And it can also be something where, it doesn't become a battle throughout the rest of the day of hey, I don't want to do this. Can I just have the iPad?
So you mentioned a little bit about modeling behavior there, and that leads into the next question, really. I mean, obviously most parents out there have screens. Like you said, they have their phones. They go to sleep with a show, something like that. How do you explain to a kid that this behavior is bad when they know, obviously, that you do it all the time? And it seems like for most people, it probably doesn't hurt you, right? They're looking at you saying, you're successful, you do this, so why can't I do this? So how do you recommend parents talk to kids like that?
I mean, the reality is that if you really talk to parents honestly about screens, so this is the first thing. We tell parents, do a radically honest check-in with yourself. How often do you find yourself on a screen instead of moving your body or exercising the way that you would like? How often do you find yourself on a screen for work or doing something where you're checking an email or you're You're doing something where you don't even mindfully taste your food when you're eating lunch at work or something like that. How often do you really see your sleep be deleted based on screen activity? Like in that sense, like parents will be like, oh, well, I wasn't tired. And I'm like, it was 11 o'clock at night and you're an incredibly tired caregiver who runs themselves ragged all day. All this is a second wind related to screens where you're sitting there thinking, I really do want to watch one more episode of Love Island. But if you actually put your head on the pillow, you'd be asleep. And that would actually be better for your wellness. Like when you wake up in the morning, you will not love your kids more because of Love Island, but you will bring a better version of yourself if you slept an extra hour. And that's just kind of what it is. And so we ask parents to kind of take that note for themselves. So that does two things. One is, A, it reminds parents how hard this is, that in a world full of screens, it can be hard to put those limits even on yourself. So to expect your kids just to be like, oh, yes, we hear your wisdom, and now we will limit ourselves on screens at all times. Oh, wise parent. It's difficult to do. That's not how screens are built. And then the other thing that it does is it helps parents not to think of this in a perfectionistic way. Like there's no perfect screen plan. Every family is different. Every family has different ways they're going to interact with screens. So, in thinking about your own behavior, what's important, though, is that once you've really taken this moment with yourself, you can articulate to kids what you do online. So like my 7-year-old and my 4-year-old know that I like to watch shows when I sit in their room at night because both kids, they like to have a parent. My wife and I kind of switch off in their room, just sitting in their room at night. And I'll watch a show on mute and on closed caption. I've watched Jack Ryan on Amazon. I don't know what any of the voices in the show sound like, but it's very suspenseful. And it keeps me awake while I'm sitting in the dark in my kid's room for 15 minutes, waiting for them to fall asleep before I leave. But I'm telling my kids about why I do what I do. I'm watching a show, while you fall asleep just because daddy needs to stay awake so I can finish the dishes and the laundry before I go to sleep. That's what I'm doing. I'm on Instagram because I'm looking at pictures from some of my college friends who I don't get to see as often because they live in other cities. And I want to know what's going on with their lives. What are you writing right now? Oh, well, I'm writing that I think it's so cool the trip they're taking together. Or I think this was like a really nice picture of their family. I want my kids to know what I'm commenting on online. I want my kids to know what I'm writing in an email or why I'm taking a moment to write an email. If I say, oh, honey, I've just got to take one moment to write an email for work, I want them to know what I'm writing about. I'll say, look, my boss asked me for something on this particular project for an important phone call we're having tomorrow. I'm just going to take a moment to send those materials. And then, I'll be back to Marble Run or building with Legos or whatever we were doing with spaceships, that kind of stuff. And it's really important because kids see why I'm making those decisions and what I'm doing with screens, why I'm kind of doing things. They know how I'm thinking about comments, what I'm thinking about in terms of text. And my 7-year-old has started to read much more fluently over the last year. And so frequently, if he sees my phone, he now sees what my wife and I are texting each other or the last few. So we're mindful about the fact that we're texting like, oh, you've got to come see this, not, oh my God, the kitchen is a disaster due to the slime project we were just doing, like that kind of stuff. And we can articulate those things. Lots of parents will say, like, I don't necessarily want my kid to be that involved in my life. And we say, like, to each their own. Like, but the more you can explicitly say what you're doing and why online, the more your kid is likely to take that on as they're a teenager and into their 20s and think it was their idea.
Now, when I was a kid, I definitely noticed and perceived that some kids spent a lot more time on their computers. They spent a lot more time on the internet, spent a lot more time working with their computers and with video games. And it seems like a lot of them as adults have really good careers in those fields. So this is a tough one because I don't think there was ever a time when parents said, go and sit down and watch a little TV because you might become a telecommunications specialist. But there is a genuine possibility that, hey, if you mess around with that computer and you learn some skills, that maybe you will become a coder or maybe you will become a software engineer. So how do you balance and how do you tell?
Completely. I mean, I grew up, especially in the 90s, in a house where, we had a centralized family computer in a public location that my sister and I could both use. Whereas, if I think about my 3 closest friends, I didn't get a video game system till I was in my teen years due to all the concern about Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter and the violence there. And so I would go to one friend's house to play video games. I would go to another friend who had a computer in his basement where we'd really like try to figure out how to like download stuff off the internet. We try to get music and, all kinds of stuff in like the sort of pre-Napster days and then into the beginning of Napster. And then, I had another friend who also had a computer in a much more private place in the house where we'd like Google all the stuff that we were interested in seeing that our parents weren't allowed to see. But, we remember the exceptions. Like the friend whose house I went to play video games and who actually had Mortal Kombat Street Fighter now works for a tech firm in Silicon Valley. I remember that story, and I'll often say that to parents where like that's a story of, screen-related success. But the reality is the kid who had the computer in his basement is now a realtor in Maryland. And the other kid whose house I went over has a decidedly non-screen related career as well. So it's like, we need to remember that like, yes, people will go into screen related careers, but that's so often the teenage argument is a kid will be like, I have to play Call of Duty because I'm going to design video games when I'm older. And like, again, designing video games is sort of like saying that you're going to play professional baseball. Like only a few people really get to do it. And even if you're really good, you still may not get to the show. And we need to just kind of, this. I keep going back with parents, the idea that like, it is very likely that somebody's going to use screens in their career or that screens are going to be a major part of whatever career they might have. So if they can't write an email or if they can't engage in an online chat, or if they don't know what's appropriate in an online chat, that's putting them at a real disadvantage for the workplace. If they don't know what a video chat's like or something like that, again, real disadvantage for the future workplace. So we want them to have the opportunity in school to video chat with their friends as they're working on projects, to be on chat, to be writing emails, and to be on screens. But it's a question as to kind of which screen experiences really walk across to their future career. And in that, I tell parents to trust their gut. Like, your kid's amount of time playing video games probably won't make it so they get one of those amazing Silicon Valley jobs. But at the same time, it's kind of this question of like, as they're playing video games, if you're checking everything off on the developmental checklist, other than their video game playing, and they're interacting with some of their friends online in the video games, and the comments and chatter you hear them making tends to be as appropriate or as respectful as you'd like them to be if they were having a play date in real life, you're in pretty good shape.
Speaking of technology, obviously, we've got AI coming on very strong now in people's minds, and it's a topic for discussion. How do you prepare parents for these rapidly changing technological leaps?
I mean, so, in general, if we're just talking about the content, what we want to prepare parents for is that by age 15 or 16, most kids have figured out their ways around any content filter that you might set up. Like, it's just not, it's no longer effective. Like, in that sense, like a parent will be like, oh, well, I can set parental controls on the TV. Okay, fine. That might work. You might be able to set, some sort of control on a kid's, internet surfing or internet browsing at some level. But most kids have figured out a myriad of solutions, or at least they can find them from their friends to get around these kinds of things. And, even if they can't, even if at some level you can set like boundaries around what apps they download with parental permission, or at some level put like some guardrails on internet content. Again, the question is, at some point, they're going to have those guardrails taken off. And how do you make sure that they're still using the internet responsibly? So this notion that like the guardrails will be kept up until they're ready doesn't prepare somebody. It's a similar thing as to, I say to parents, like in that sense, it'd be like saying, okay, I'm going to make it so my kid has no real life play dates with kids until they're 16. And then all of a sudden they're supposed to know how to hang. And like they've never actually had a play date at somebody's house or learned how to share or take turns or have conversations. So how do we make sure that like we're monitoring their behavior online, but we're understanding that like at some level they'll probably get around content filters and be able to look at or download or do stuff that we don't like, but we're involved in their lives at an earlier stage to think about how they're interacting with this content. So it's going back to kind of middle school ages. A lot of times where parents are first starting to give their kids independence and they're saying, look, I might be willing to give you a profile on this particular app. And on that profile, here's what I expect to see. Here's what I expect to see in terms of my access to that profile and the comments that you make, the messages that you send. And for a while, this should be a relationship where I have access to those things. I will check it infrequently. I don't plan to check it very often. But when I do check, I won't tend to go deep. Like I'm not planning on looking at every message you've ever sent. But my hope is that I see you behaving the same way that I would ask you to behave if, you know, this was something in real life. If you're making negative comments on other people's profiles, if you're sending, you know, messages, if you're creating fake profiles, if you're, you know, we can list off any number of things we worry about kids engaging in online. If you're looking at this type of content, you know, it's going to be fairly obvious. And, you know, that's when I won't be able to trust that you can independently be on these websites. So show me that I can trust you, and you'll get increasing levels of independence. It's the same thing as what we tell teenagers when they start getting curfews and they start being out with their friends and we start seeing them make decisions. The other thing that's similar to what we say to teens when they're out, you know, with their friends in a curfew is we'll always tell parents, when you're messaging about drugs and alcohol, you tell your teens, I don't want you to use drugs or drink, but at the same time, if you get in a really bad situation and you need help, you call me. The punishment is always going to be less if you got into trouble and you call me than if you got into trouble and didn't call me. And it's a weird doublespeak that you're telling teens. It's the same thing online. It's saying, look, I trust you to be online and to make respectful comments and to be, you know, a respectful online citizen. At the same time, if you ever get in trouble, if someone's harassing you online, if someone's bullying you online, if someone's trying to, you know, extort you online, any number of things, telling me about it will always be better than trying to hide it from me because I can't help. Because what we worry about are these situations that teens get into. And I just had this happen actually recently with a patient of mine where someone claimed to have hacked his phone and found photos of him that were compromising, that they were going to release to all the contacts in his contact list if he didn't start sending them money. And it's a really common kind of online scam. And thankfully, this kid was pretty smart, sent me a screenshot of it and just said, this is ridiculous. You know, obviously I'm not doing this. This person is claiming to have photos I never took, you know, which is great that the kid didn't have any bad photos on the phone. But it's like one of those things we can easily see how a kid would be like, oh my God, you know, if they really have hacked my phone, like there's some stuff I would never want out there. Like I had a kid, you know, a couple of years back who had photos of him and his friends smoking pot that his parents didn't know about and said like, oh my God, if that got out, like this would be terrible. But with those kids, like they're like, oh my God, my life will be over if it got out. And we'll do a strategy called Downward Arrow. We'll be like, really? So what would happen? Like, and they're like, well, my parents would be so mad. And I'm like, yeah. And then what would they do? Well, they'd probably ground me. Okay, for how long? I don't know, maybe like 2 weeks. I mean, it'd be terrible. I wouldn't be able to see my friends. I'm like, and then after 2 weeks, well, they'd ask me like to send them a lot of information about where I am and who I'm with and make sure to like kind of, you know, well, I guess that's the same thing as what they're doing now. And I'm like, right. So if they found out about this, it'd be 2 weeks of you being grounded, and then you kind of go back to your life and just have to kind of rebuild trust. And kids are like, oh yeah, I guess it's not like so terrible. And so at that point, we're like, okay, in that case, we're not going to play into this extortion. But that's where we want kids to be thinking, if I really got into a jam, I could still utilize my parents and they would be, you know, perhaps my parent or my caregiver would be happy to help.
So let's try to get down to some brass tacks for parents if we can. There's a lot of confusion, I think, around recommendations, particularly here, because there isn't so much hard data necessarily to point to a specific number and say, this is the amount, right? So it sounds like the previous wisdom was for kids under 2 years old to have basically no screen time at all. Obviously, they'll see stuff from time to time, but they shouldn't have it as a part of their life. And then at over 2 years old, that it should be limited to an hour or less than 2 hours daily. Can you talk about that? Because there's also other opinions that say, well, these numbers may be true and they may be good and positive, but obviously to have less screen time is a good thing, but those benchmarks are largely arbitrary. They're not really based on anything. So can you talk a little bit about that and how you recommend parents assess that situation for their kids?
Totally. Because look, you know, these are recommendations that are coming from highly respected institutions like the American Academy of Pediatrics that are trying to give parents some sort of roadmap to say, look, if you're going to hang your hat on something, in the same way as like a parent might look up online, how many hours of sleep should this aged child get as a way of like getting something? They're also looking up like how many hours of screens, you know, should be allowed at this particular age. And, you know, to the point that you were just summarizing, it's not so much that these are gospel. There is a somewhat arbitrary aspect of this where what we're really talking about in screen time guidelines is managing risk. It's trying to say, here are the risks we know about. And if we're trying to get down to brass tacks and say, look, here's the amount of time, we're trying to be both realistic and then also think about how much time that age kid should be spending in other things. Like the reason why we don't want 2-year-old kids and under to be on screens too much is that there are so many important developmental tasks where we can show it's not so much the screens are insidiously bad. Like, you know, a 1-year-old seeing an episode of something on television is not going to necessarily harm them. It's more that we know they should be doing other things that are really important for their development during that time, and where there's no substitute for what's happening in real life. For, you know, the age range where it might be recommended that they have no more than an hour or two, and that, you know, that should be spent. And there's always these recommendations about, like, you know, high quality programming and or FaceTiming relatives, which came up during the pandemic as kind of a recommendation. Again, this is people indexing risk. It's saying for kids who are spending this much time on screens, it's less likely that certain really important developmental tasks are going to be displaced. When you get into the teenage years, you know, the way that we're thinking about it is that there's sort of a Goldilocks hypothesis around screens. Teens should be on screens to a certain degree. They need to understand that world. It's bad to arrive at college having never been on screens in this day and age. So in that sense, like, there's a sort of just right amount, but that just right amount is not necessarily universally agreed on amount of time and screen related behavior. It's more about this idea that if you've got an adolescent, you know, what we know is they should have some screen time, and then beyond 3 hours a day, there are particularly negative effects. So somewhere in there between this kind of 0 and 3 hours, it might be the porridge being just right for a teenager, where they're still engaging, they're still learning about the world, they might be utilizing it for school, they might be engaging with their friends, they might be connecting with peers, they might be learning certain things, they might be watching shows. But at the end of the day, what we know to be the negative effect with adolescents is that adolescents who spend more than 3 hours on screens, inevitably, they're more likely to report mental health concerns, and they're more likely to report feelings of isolation. They're more likely to report that, you know, they're not doing terribly well. And again, we don't know that the things they're doing on the screens at that moment or during those hours are intrinsically harmful. What we know is that at the end of the day, having spent that much time on screens, they A, have not engaged in the tasks of daily life, and B, tend to feel pretty badly about themselves. And we want to decrease those effects. So the more we can see parents who are saying, okay, maybe my teenager is spending an hour or two on average during the week, and then on the weekends they're spending a bit more perhaps on screens, but I'm also aware of what they're doing in their online world, that's kind of where the porridge is just right.
And what about when it comes to cell phones? Because obviously a kid arriving at college, having never spent meaningful time in front of a screen, is going to be at a disadvantage. Similarly, I think a kid arriving at college, having never spent time working with a mobile device, might be at some sort of similar disadvantage. So I think most parents are giving their kids cell phones at some point. What's the recommendation for that? It's obviously way more difficult to keep track of screen time once they've got that in their pocket. So how do parents navigate that?
Right. I mean, you'll see media stories online about parent communities who will make pacts, you know, to try to get to the end of middle school without giving the kids cell phones and stuff like that. Realistically, we're seeing late elementary school, early middle school as the times when a lot of kids are perhaps seeing, you know, their first device or cell phone. And a lot of kids, even at younger ages, are getting their first device in elementary school, like where there might be a particular tablet that a kid is using, you know, to watch shows or consume content, things like that. So, you know, what we think about is, like, if a kid is first getting a cell phone in middle school, we want parents to be clear on the rules of the road. And there are lots of organizations, Common Sense Media, the Child Mind Institute, many others that are focused on kind of youth mental health, where there are guides online saying, like, before you get your kid a phone, here's the contract to think about. Here are the things to think about like what you're okay with them using. Here are some apps where you can set up controls about, for example, what apps they download from the App Store and what they're allowed to kind of access, what accounts they can set up and how you have access to those things. So even for non-screen savvy parents, there are a lot of resources out there to say, like, look, even if you're not on TikTok or you're not on Instagram, here are ways to set up these sort of guardrails for your kids as they say, I have to be on these so I'm not left out. But for most kids, it's somewhere around middle school. And the framing for most parents is that this is not, especially around middle school, it's not necessarily they're giving their kids this device so that they can use it on their own independently without any monitoring. It's that in middle school, we're often saying like a phone can be checked in and checked out for certain things. The kid does not need to think that it's a right to have this in their room at all times. In many ways, it should be a device for their social life, for them to communicate with their friends. And in the event that as a middle schooler, they're starting to venture out and go on more independent social excursions, with their friends, it's a device for them to communicate with their parents and for their parents to kind of know where they are and know that they're safe. And then beyond that, as they start to get into the use of the phone, a lot of times what we'll say to parents is like, if they're starting to utilize a new app or they're starting to get into something, have them sit down and explain to you what the app is, what they're doing on it, like what it's like, because it makes for better conversations as time goes on between the parent and the child. If you've got some idea of like, for example, just the landscape of Instagram, the fact that like a parent can know that you've got friends on Instagram, that at the same time you can search for content, and then you also have these reels that can get fed to you via an algorithm, as you're looking at this, and that those are three very distinct things that you can do on that app, and they should be aware of what their kid might be doing and what that looks like. And we'll often tell parents like, it's really interesting, even if you spent 30 seconds looking, for example, at some apps like TikTok and Instagram, the algorithm has figured out what your kid likes. It has figured it out by how long they stay on it and where they're, how much eye contact they're getting with that particular thing. And so like, if you want to get a sense and you watch for 30 seconds your teenage son or daughter's TikTok, you will know what content they're really interested in. And that leads to a lot of questions and a lot of conversation. So even saying to your kid, I'm going to get to watch your TikTok feed for 3 minutes, once a week, like you're going to see like, oh, my kid's into sports highlights and at the same time, super violent pranks. Like this is not something that I feel okay about. Why are we watching this? And like that kind of thing. Or I'll go online and see that this person's looking at a lot of, content that's focused on getting the perfect body or cosmetics or like, that kind of thing. And like, that makes me have questions about like how my teen is thinking about their own body. And it's a good thing to have kind of that window and to be their digital neighbor.
And lastly, the big question we have for you here is really about long-term effects. I think we've talked a lot about the sort of ideal situations where parents are thinking about this and addressing it from the cradle on up. But I think the reality is that a lot of parents are already looking at their kids and saying these kids are already spending way too much time on screens. It's out of control already, and now we need to rein it back in. So can you talk a little bit about what are some long-term effects for kids and what can parents do to try and reverse the course?
In general, and I think this is kind of the way we think about it, is that we see a lot of parents who will say, look, I didn't anticipate this, okay? Like, I've lived a busy life. I've been working to make ends meet for my family. I didn't exactly have time to like learn my kids' online world and know exactly what they're doing. But like right now, I am concerned, or I'm concerned about the amount of time they're spending or the video games they're playing or what they're seeing on social media. And what we say to parents is like, it's never too late to start intervening and to kind of get in the middle of it. And, especially because, and this goes back to whether it's curfew, whether it's transportation, even with older teens, parents are often still holding to some degree the keys to the kingdom. Like there's curfew, there's some level of like money that might be for them to be able to go out and get a hot dog with friends or see a movie. There's transportation. And there's the fact they're likely paying for that phone. So given that you hold some control over that, you don't really want to have to flex that unless it's a real emergency. That's kind of like the thing we remind parents, like, here's the wall. But, as you're thinking about this, you can express this kind of concern to a teen. Now, what's really important is this. If a teen is spending too much time online or too much time on screen-related activities and parents becoming really concerned, don't reject the screen-related activities themselves. Express concern about the teen, but then move with curiosity into trying to understand their world and how they're on it, and then figuring out what their goals might be and how you can collaboratively set them. So I'll walk through that process. So we'll often tell parents is like, if I'm trying to get a teen to change their behavior, I don't say Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, these are all useless wastes of time. I can't believe that your iPhone reports that you spent 27 hours on these things in the last 5 days. Like, you are rotting your brain. I can't believe this. This is an important part of teens' world. If you say that, their answer is, you just don't get me. Like, there's no way you're going to get me. Sure, I'll go through the dog and pony show of maybe like allying with you on the fact that like I should cut down or listen to you just so I don't get my phone taken away. But you're never going to get to that place where they make decisions about their wellness. In the same way as anyone, like you don't make decisions. I always give parents the example of like when I first joined a gym when I was living in LA as a postdoc, I was so excited because I just got a gym membership. It was my first gym membership. And, you know, you got 2 free sessions with a personal trainer. And the first personal trainer came over to me and said, why are you lifting like that? Your form is terrible. You're never going to get muscles like that. I did not go forward in that personal training session. I said, you know what? I'm good. You must have been mistaken. I don't need a free personal training session. The second one came over and was like, I'm so glad you've made great decisions for your fitness. And I cannot wait to be your partner on this journey. And I was like, I like this guy. Like, this guy is going to help get me where I want to go. And that's a similar thing for teenagers. If you come into it and say, look, I'm concerned because there are certain things going on in your life that I want to help you with, where like I feel like maybe we're not on the same page about school, or we're not on the same page about like the fact you quit the team last week. And I'm worried about that. I don't want you to be home every afternoon, just in bed on your phone when you could have been playing, you know, lacrosse or field hockey. Like there was an opportunity there. And I'm just concerned. I want to figure out how to find balance. You know, can you help me understand like how you're spending your time or what's going on? And it may not be in the first conversation, and you don't have to be all that understanding, but the more you understand why they're online, the more you might be able to get a teen to say, you know what, you're right. I don't want to be doing this at all times. I would like your help with this particular thing, because you're not rejecting their world. In the event that you have a teen who gets really angry or says, no, I'm not going to stop. Like, I don't care. I quit soccer. I don't care about school. Just leave me alone. Let me be on my phone in my room. You know, what I often tell parents is that may be the reason to seek help from a mental health professional or a school counselor or any other community member who you think might be able to kind of help you with this situation. Or it may be the moment to go to a place of setting more boundaries. We're saying like, look, I'm going to actually set limits on this if you can engage with me on doing something more healthy, and I'm going to have to remove the phone. I'm going to have to remove this particular privilege so that we can actually meet somewhere in the middle. And it's a really tough place to be with a parent. That's why we often recommend they do it with support.
Thank you very much for your time today, Dr. Anderson. That was a really amazing discussion about screen time, and we got some really interesting perspectives and suggestions for parents.
What I will say to parents is this, as kind of a final closing message. It's just that I cannot tell you how disproportionate we are as a society in how we view risk. So, you know, we want parents to take a safety-first approach with screens. And to be sure, there is research at this stage that is the reason for the Surgeon General's advisory, that we know there are certain vulnerable populations of kids or particular lines of vulnerability where we want to caution parents and make sure they're thinking in a practical and kind of thoughtful way about how their kids interact with screens. At the same time, the drivers of youth mental health are bigger than screens. So when we talk in this country about, you know, youth mental health, and particularly about the crisis that we find ourselves in, which was the Surgeon General's report prior to the current one on screens, where the Surgeon General didn't just issue an advisory, but instead said in much stronger terms, we are at a crisis point for youth mental health in terms of rising hospitalizations and rising suicidality. Our hypothesis is that while screens can play a role in exacerbating mental health for teens or certain youth who are vulnerable, they're not driving the mental health crisis. That access to care, prevention-focused work around mental health, breaking down stigma, talking about mental health, giving kids mental health skills from early ages, making sure they have access to providers, making sure that mental health care is provided for under insurance, making sure that we have a workforce that is diverse and able to provide for the mental health needs of our population. And as a country, agreeing that things like poverty, food insecurity, incredible kind of like family stress and conflict and things like that are much more likely to be drivers of negative youth mental health than time perhaps spent playing video games. And if we can kind of think through that a little bit more, I think we can turn our attention to the things that are going to solve this crisis rather than some of the things that might be playing like a role at the tail end Like, and that's where, if we're really thinking about how to kind of solve this crisis together, screens are part of a multifaceted solution that involve showing up for our youth and thinking about what they really need to be able to support them and to be well throughout their development.
For IdeaStream Public Media, I'm Yigal Kaufman. Thanks for joining us for this Ohio Learns 360 webinar, and please join us for future webinars on other topics.